I'd be interested to hear when you first came to the Slocan, or if were you born here?
Yeah, I was born right here in Crescent Valley. I'm living a half a mile from where I was born.
When were you born?
1918.
Had your parents come here?
Yes. My father came here about 1905 or 6 to Winlaw to work for his uncle John Winlaw, who had a sawmill established in that what is now the town of Winlaw. And he came out here with 2 carloads of horses from northeastern Saskatchewan, having originally come from town of Norval and Georgetown, just north of Toronto. And my mother, her father was a retired member of the British Army Medical Corps, and he came to Canada in 1904, having bought land sight unseen, and found it on the shores of Kootenay Lake, standing straight up and down. So of course he didn't waste much time there, and he was deaf as a result of his Army experiences. And they bought land in Tagum, and he got a job as a watchman at the mill in Winlaw. And my dad, as a young man, met my mother as a young woman. Incidentally, she was born in Malta during one of my grandfather's stays in the Mediterranean. And so they married in Winlaw, and the mill in Winlaw burnt in 1912. And as I mentioned earlier about people like Harry Nixon, in asking him when the mill started in Winlaw, he said, well, we came in 1901, he said, and it was already there. So that goes back to at least 1900. And after the mill burnt there, Dad made a few moves. So he went over to Bridesville and worked over there briefly and had an accident whereby he lost a foot. So he then took up bookkeeping and came to work for the lumber company that built the village of Crescent Valley, and stayed on. The original mill and operation here in Crescent Valley was built by the Patricks of hockey fame. And they built a sawmill and a store with a pool hall and a dance hall and something like 20 houses. Some of them were small cottages, but about 18 of them were good-sized 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom houses.
That was the Patrick Lumber Company?
Yeah. Lester Patrick, who eventually became president of the National Hockey League, was one of 2 brothers that were involved with their father in this sawmill operation. The other brother was Frank, who was later associated with the Boston Bruins. But they suffered a tremendous loss in logs due to a flood. As near as I can gather from the old-timers, it happened in 1910 or 11. In the fall of 1910 is as close as I can come. And if you were to refer to the book titled Patrick's, The Royal Family of Hockey, it tells about it fairly extensively in that book. And they then, in 1911 or 12, sold the business to the British Canadian Lumber Corporation, who ran it until it shut down in 1919. And my father was then working for them as a bookkeeper, and when they were deciding to shut down, they were, thinking of ways to dispose of the property, and they had sold the mill machinery to a mill in Merritt. And they proceeded to dismantle the mill and all the rest of the facilities that went along with it, the planer mill, the burner, and so on. and the tramways, etc. And the property itself, they sold lock, stock, and barrel, houses and store and everything, to my father, who ran the store and farmed the land and rented the houses.
Huh.
So, it was a busy community. And through the Depression years, other small mills functioned in the area. Like Val Koziansik just up the road was one of the more permanent ones. And Gordon Burns established Burns Lumber Company at Passmore. And Grover Cady, an American, established Cady Lumber and Pole in the area here. And he operated around Nelson and as far out as back up in the Little Slocan, ran a good-sized sawmill back in there. Burns Lumber was sold, and I don't know who of the Burns family there is around Nelson that you might contact, unless you that could give you some of the history of that. But you know, most of the people in this area worked for Gordon Burns or his successors. Axel Eriksson from Colville came along and bought him out. And then Triangle Pacific, which was a combination of an American firm from Portland or somewhere, along with Pacific Logging, which was a subsidiary of Canadian Pacific. They took over the mill and moved it to Slocan, where it's presently located. And
the Triangle Pacific mill was not on the site of the current Slocan Forest Products mill, was it?
yeah, exactly.
I see. I thought there was a mill just about a mile this side of
Yeah, that was a Japanese fellow, and I just, for the moment, can't think of his name. I'm not sure if it was Nishimura or what it was, but he operated where Triangle Pacific now have a storage yard there. And there's a big sawdust pile there and so on, but that wasn't their mill. They operated right where it is now, and after Triangle Pacific, they became Slocan Forest Products, and some of the local people became shareholders in it, and so on, and they've continued to operate on that site, upgrading the mill considerably.
Where did the Hicks family fit in there?
Well, the Hickses had a little mill in the area too. They got involved in logging and lumbering, and I wouldn't want to try to tell their story for them, you know, but many of these smaller operations were very seasonal. You couldn't function in the mills very well in the wintertime because the logs were frozen, the mill pond was frozen, dirt was frozen on the logs, you name it, problems everywhere. But it was a great time of the year to do the logging and store the logs and so on and get them down by whatever, mostly by the river or whatever, you know, or the lake. And then start in the spring and saw all summer until fall, you know.
Were the large mills seasonal as well?
No. The mill here, to the best of my knowledge, you see, they brought, in the very beginning, they logged this immediate area here by horses, you know, and the logs were brought down, and they stored their logs in the river. And if you notice, there's a row of piling right up the middle of the river. Those pilings used to extend above the water level by at least 20 feet to accommodate high water and so on, and the storage of logs, and also to keep the logs on the one side of the river so they wouldn't create a log jam, which they did one time and washed out the whole farming area over there on the other side of the river. But that row of pilings extended up to the point where the Little Slocan joins the main Slocan River. And there was a space there of a matter of 2 miles or thereabouts where Mr. Coe, spelled K-O-C-H, who ran a mill at Coe Siding just north of Slocan Park, he brought his logs down out of Coe Creek, while the Patricks brought theirs out of the Little Slocan Lakes. And they brought them out of that area on a road that had a very slight even grade to it, and they brought them out by team and sleigh all winter and stored them on the banks of the river and then dumped them in the spring when the water was high, so they would come down with the least possible problem. And it was, I suppose, a malfunction of that practice that happened due to excessive rains and so on, and bringing the water up in the late fall. When normally we have snowfall, they got rain, and it caused a flood to break away the log jams, the log decks they had up at the upper end, and they came all down here at one time, and they couldn't hold them. And the logs collected down here, and the water just kept rising, and the logs kept coming until they went over their dam that they had to retain the logs, and they had a series of 3 small and 1 large dam. And they went over each one of those dams, which constituted holding ponds, and piled up against the large dam, which was right alongside of the highway down there below the police station, and blocked the river solid. Well, the result of that was that nobody's going to stop the water. It's going to go by, and it just started cutting into that sandbank on the, I'd say, the northeast side of the river, and of course it cut the sandbank out, and down came the railroad. Well, just prior to the railroad being washed out, they could see what was going to happen. The CPR dynamited the dam and the log jam to try and let the wood get away and the water get away. And it worked, except that it was too late. The logs went down into the States, and the railroad went with it. And so the railroad had to cut a new corner, new grade all around through that bend and rebuild, and the highway had to be rebuilt and so on. But the Patricks themselves didn't recover from that, and I guess that dam was never rebuilt. The British Canadian Lumber Corporation seemed to function on a different basis and brought their logs down and held them, I guess, in smaller amounts, and kept functioning that way.
Would they actually bring down a whole season's worth of logs at one time?
Generally speaking, yeah,
So
because there was no such thing as there is now with trucks or any other means of transportation of bringing logs to them. And in fact, as I recall, if you know what a jackladder is,
yes,
a device, where they can bring the logs up out of the water and into the mill. Well, they built a jackladder at the site of that lower dam that I'm talking about that was blasted. They built a jackladder there so that logs that did get by on them could be drawn up to the railroad track and loaded onto flat cars and brought down here and back down into the mill. Recircled, or recycled, or whatever you want to call it. And that functioned until they shut down. And I guess the shutdown resulted from a fire they had in the mill in the fall of 1918. And just at that time, the war ended. And of course, the boom was starting to show its signs of disappearing. And in the spring of the year, they had to make a decision as to whether, the spring of 1919, whether they would keep going or what they would do, and they got a sale for their mill equipment, and the price of lumber had gone down to $7 or $8 a thousand. So they just sold the lumber they had on hand and sold the mill and everything and packed up and left.
And did a lot of people move out of the valley then?
Oh yes, people moved out. In fact, I had an experience when I was about 14, I guess. I'd be 1932 or thereabouts. And I was attending the store during noon hour while Dad went home to eat, and he usually had a little rest after lunch, and so I was there at the store out on the veranda. It was a nice summer day, and a car drove up with an Idaho license on it. And two gentlemen and their wives got out of the car and came over to me and asked who ran the place, and I told them, and they wanted to know if it'd be all right to go and wander around through the village, because the one of them had worked in this mill when it was functioning. And he gave me his name and so on, and he said that he now worked in a big mill at Potlatch, Idaho. So they went and looked the mill over, and he showed his friends, I think it was his brother that he had with him, where they had lived and who lived in the other houses and so on during those days. Well, they came back to the store and bought some pop and cookies and what have you, and then went on their way. But they had told me who they were, you know. So this chap and his friends drove away, and I'd say 5 years ago, thereabouts, I was walking down for the mail. It's a half a mile from here down to the post office, and I quite often either walk down or ride my bike down there and get the mail. And, you know, having lived here all this time, when you see somebody walking even a quarter of a mile away, you say, oh, they're so-and-so, you know. You can just tell by the way they walk and the way they dress and so on, you know. So I was on my way down, and as I approached the railroad crossing down there, I noticed this chap walking across the bridge. And I thought first it was somebody I knew, and then gradually I began to realize it was a stranger, you know. So we met at the top of the hill there leading up from the bridge, and he asked me what river this was, and whatever started this village and what went on, and I told him, and he said, well, I worked in a big sawmill myself, and I said, where was that? And he says, Potlatch, Idaho. And so I began to tell him that there was this couple had visited me in 1932 from Potlatch, and that man had worked in this mill. But for the life of me, I couldn't remember his name at the moment. So this motorhome was parked right there, and he said, well, I better get in, he said, and have my lunch. He said, I see my wife waving to me, you know. So he went in, and I went on down and got my mail, and on the way back, I noticed this motorhome was still there. So I began to concentrate on who that was that had visited here in 32, and I remembered his first name was Carl, and I kept walking along, and then it came to me, Carl Wardrop. So I came up to this motorhome, and I rapped on the window, and the lady opened the window, and I said, you know, I just remembered the name of that fella that worked here and in Potlatch, and it was Carl Wardrop. Well, he and his wife started to laugh, and they said, you know, Carl and his brother Charlie Wardrop worked in that mill at Potlatch, and he was my foreman for 25 years. Isn't that a coincidence?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, was it common for people to go back and forth across the line into Idaho then?
Oh, definitely in those days, in the earlier days, it was quite common. In fact, when my uncle served in the 54th Kootenay Battalion, this was my mother's brother, and he served in the Field Engineering Corps, and he came back here, and having had this kind of experience, he joined in with my father, who by now was running the store here in Crescent Valley, had taken over in 1919 or thereabouts. And some people had come in from Saskatchewan and built a sawmill back in just about the height of land between Goose Creek and Pass Creek. A family by the name of Renwicks. And they were bringing the lumber out to Crescent Valley to load on the rail cars by horse and wagon. And back there, the whole of that area from the other side of the bridge back, and even on this side of the bridge for that matter, is very sandy soil. It's just like an old lake bottom, and I guess that's what it was. And that sand is just the next thing to quicksand, you know. And these wagons loaded with lumber were just burying themselves, and the horses just couldn't pull them. They had standby teams at every little hill, and they had piles of lumber scattered all along the road trying to get it down here, you know, and it was just not working out. So Dad, having been a storekeeper, was naturally the one they called on for supplies and so on, and that store had everything in it you could imagine. And before long, you know, they entered into an agreement, and Dad went to work as a partner in the mill business with them to try and recover some of this lost trade. Well, along with this uncle of mine, which was my dad's brother-in-law, of course, they got the idea to build a flume, which was not uncommon in this area at that time. There were several good long flumes around. Mm-hmm. And they built a flume from that mill in Pass Creek right here into Crescent Valley in one season, and had the lumber coming right down and loading onto flat cars here without a hitch. Oh. And that carried on for several years. And then a lawsuit developed with a family that owned the timber back in there, and that family won the lawsuit over the manner in which the logging was being done on their property. Mm-hmm. And in the settlement process, they got the mill and quite a bit of cash, but the flume was my father's option, and he just cut the flume off, and so that brought an end to the whole thing. And in 1925 or 6, the high water took the flume out where it crossed the river over there. Mm-hmm. Log jam piled up against the center pier and tore it out.
Were they fluming the logs down as well?
No.
To the mill? No,
they were bringing the logs in by horses, and they used what they call a dolly, you know. It's now a similar situation to that would be these arches that they use behind a cat, you know. But they had a two-wheeled device that they hooked behind horses, and they raised the front end of the logs up on that, so just the back end of the log was dragging in the ground, you know.
Did that replace the sloop?
Yeah, that was just the sloop was still used in the wintertime. Mm-hmm. For doing the same thing, but in the summer months they used a dolly.
Mm-hmm. And what were they logging primarily?
Oh, this area had a very good assortment of fir, cedar, spruce, balsam, and pine. Mm-hmm. There was quite a lot of ponderosa pine, which grows to a good size, and white pine. There was beautiful white pine in the area.
How large was the Patrick Lumber Company's mill?
See, it was an immense mill. In fact, I have recently acquired some very good pictures of it. Mm-hmm. But I have seen their letter headings where they were capable of cutting 300,000 board feet per day.
300,000
board feet per day, and that's a big mill, yeah, by any standard. And it was, you know, there were bigger mills at the coast, but it was the biggest mill in the interior at that time. It functioned with 2 carriages, steam-powered carriages, you know, and double cut bandsaws. The bandsaws had teeth on both sides, you know, and they cut the log going both ways.
And it was all powered by steam?
Yeah, yeah. They used their own slabs and edgings and so on to fire the boilers with.
But a mill of that size would have demanded a fair supply of logs then.
Oh, definitely. In fact, it was one of the comments I heard a number of times was that that mill was really too big for the logging methods of those days in this area. Mm-hmm. Such things as railroad logging and so on, it was used at the coast on Vancouver Island and many other places, as well as flumes and chutes and so on. Around here, the logs had to be brought quite a distance, you know. Back in the bush, I guess it's a good 25 miles back to the Little Slocan Lakes. Mm-hmm. And they used the river to do their logging.
Had they log most of the accessible timber then by the time they sold out?
Oh yes, that's another factor. This place had been logged very heavily, and the logging from here to where the little Slocan branches off from the main Slocan River had been just small spots and so on. They hadn't heavily logged the mountains along here, but they were pretty steep too. But all the flat land had been logged, and then they went back into the little Slocan, and then there they logged mountains, and that was to their advantage, for sliding the logs down in the wintertime. They didn't even have to build a chute. They just wait till the skid trail froze solid and got snow on it, and horses would come to the top of a steep part, and they got so smart, they would just step off to the side and let the logs go by. And what they used in those days was a dog, a piece of bent iron driven in, which would be strictly illegal now, because you keep hammering that bent iron into the logs, and the next thing you know, it breaks off in there. And then that hits the head saw, and somebody gets killed.
Did that happen in those days?
Yes, it did. Yeah. Over there where the Trail Country Golf Club is at Birchbank, there was a sawmill up there on the west side of the highway in Sullivan Creek. And a local fellow from here by the name of Andy Life, well, actually his home was in Slocan City, but he boarded with some friends here for several years. And Andy was a sawyer in this little mill up there, and that's exactly what happened to him. The saw hit one of those dogs that were broken off in the log and took the top right off his head.
But you were telling me about the horses would step aside, and would the dog pop out?
Yeah, oh yeah. The dog was put in a slant, and so when it was turned around in the log, it pulled out quite easily. You see, as long as the horse was pulling straight ahead, it did its job. And that was done right here. In fact, we're sitting right beside the skid trail that was used in those days. And my first logging operation that I got involved in was for a firm that was logging that place for the second time. And they were doing exactly that. They had big perch-run horses, and these horses would just walk up to the edge of a steep spot and step out of the way and let the logs go down the hill.
But by then all the large mills in the area had closed, is that right?
Yes, this particular mill was gone, but the Waldeys were still functioning over at Robson, just across the river from Castlegar, and that's where the logs were going then. And there was a mill in Nelson at that time, which kept changing hands so often that I can't remember just who had it in those years. But Mr. Cady was one of them who operated in there. But Waldeys operated on the shores of the Arrow Lakes there and the Columbia River for many, many years. They were an important part of the industry.
Did your logs go there by water?
The logs from here? No, my first job up here was loading and hauling the logs with a truck and trailer from here to Robson, 1940. I thought it was a big thing in those days to have a 3-ton truck and a trailer made out of the rear axle of some other old truck. And
can you describe your truck to me?
Yes, I can even show you pictures of it, I think. But you take a 3-ton, the heavy-duty 3-ton Chev truck in those days was called a Maple Leaf. Single axle, hydraulic brakes with a vacuum assist on the brakes. And of course, one of the disadvantages of the vacuum assist, even though it did provide a great deal of power to the hydraulic cylinder, it drew air from the same source that the engine got it, and immediately the air was drawn out of this vacuum chamber into the engine. The engine then lost its holding power, so then you were momentarily more dependent on your brakes. But anyhow, there was no such connection to the trailer. The trailer was just made out of another old truck axle that had mechanical brakes on it. And so you have a an extra handbrake handle in the cab with a clothesline wire running back along the reach to the trailer brakes, you know. And, when you would be going around a corner to the left, you'd have to pull the handle right back to the seat, and when you're going around a corner to the right, because of the lining of that alignment of that cable, why it didn't always align just properly, and you probably wouldn't be able to pull it at all. The brakes would start coming on by themselves.
Did you make the bunks in the trailer here?
Oh yes, they're made out of wood shaped, you know, hewed even by hand, you know, and hand drilled, you know. There was no stakes or anything as we use nowadays. You'd drill about a 2-inch hole through the end of the bunk. They were 8 feet long, you know, and they would be 8 or 10 inches in depth and a foot wide. And you'd drill a hole through there to put a piece of chain in there for your wrappers on the load, and quite often you'd put a horseshoe on the end of the bunk upside down, so that the cleat on the horseshoe would act as something to hold the first log on each side. And then you would pile the next deck on, tier, and leave a little space between the center 2 logs, and put a wrapper chain over it, not too tight. When you put the next layer on, that would press that chain down in between that space and tighten up on the side logs. Otherwise, you'd never get it unhooked, you see, when you'd come to the other end of the road. And chains were used almost exclusively instead of cables, and what they called a fit hook. And chains were used almost exclusively instead of cables, and what they called a fit hook. A fit hook was a big flat hook with a long slot in it, and you put the chain through a link, through a loop, and then put this hook on.
Right.
And then all you had to do was bat that off of there, you see. And I don't know why there weren't more people killed doing that kind of thing, you know, than there was. But boy, you had to be just like a cat, you know, around there. And of course, cork shoes were the order of the day. And when you got off, finished loading, got in your truck, why, imagine what cork shoes would do. And if you know what I mean by corks, they were sharp steel pins in the soles of your shoes so you could walk on logs. Well, if you put your foot on a steel pedal in the cab, it just slipped off. So you had big pieces of belting tied to the brake and the clutch pedal and the accelerator pedal so that your foot wouldn't slide off, you know, when you were putting the brakes on and so on. But these poor little things, you know, with less than 100 horsepower, trying to drag these loads of logs up these hills, and snowing, you know, and you'd be putting the chains on, and if you left them on when you got over the top, well, you'd beat them all to pieces, so you took them off, and come to the next hill, you'd put them back on, and it was quite a game. But, you know, we really thought we were doing something in those days.
Did the change come quickly to trucks?
No. I suppose the involvement of human beings calls for change to come from several directions, you know. First of all, when the first probably big change came with the tandem axle setup. And oh my goodness, you wouldn't believe the concoctions that they cooked up, you know. You could hardly believe that engineering people would make such contraptions that didn't work. And they were just a source of problem, you know. And they still just changed one thing, was the tandem suspension system. They had no idea how to provide the gear ratios. They thought that if they put 2 3-ton axles in there, that they should be able to haul 8 or 10 ton, because they were always overloading the 3-ton single axle by 100%. So they put 2 3-ton axles in the back of a truck. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that both of those axles are going to have positive traction, good traction on the ground at the same time. If one gets into a puddle and slips, all the weight came on the other one. Well, they just tore them out right and left, you know. They finally, you know, realized they had to put 2 heavier axles in both, and then they began to get some headway. Then they had to get away from hydraulic brakes. You'd be coming down these long hills, and it was common for the brake fluid to start to boil in the wheels. The brakes would get so hot. And then your pedal would just go to the floor and you were on your way. And a number of people got killed that way. And of course, the first thing you tried to do is put it in the bank, or some people try to jump and the thing would run over them and all the rest of it, you know. Well, then the next thing, of course, trailers had been used for some time in the single axle truck, but when they came to tandems, the next step was the bridges. Bridges didn't have the capacity to hold those loads that they were capable of hauling. Gasoline engines held back to some degree, and people used to say by compression. Well, that's a mistaken poor use of words, because when you're going down the hill with a gasoline engine, a carburetor type engine, you take your foot off the accelerator, there is no compression. There's no source of air. So what happens is that a vacuum builds up, and we used to have vacuum gauges to tell how much vacuum you had for our brakes. And that vacuum builds up on the top of the piston and restricts its movement. Can't stop it, but it restricts its movement. And of course, by the same token, vacuum as opposed to compression creates cold rather than heat. Compression creates heat. So now your engine is cooling off rapidly. The parts in there, like the pistons, etc., contract, and you just sucked the oil up out of the oil pan into the manifold, into the combustion chamber, and blew it out through the exhaust. And this was a big problem. And that's what causes backfiring, is that the engine timing is such, the valve timing arrangement is such that now the engine is sucking air. It can't get it through the air cleaner and carburetor, so it starts sucking it back up the exhaust pipe. And that in turn gets up into the manifold, and the flame coming out of the exhaust ports ignites the unburned fuel that's laying in the exhaust system. And by the same token, the spark retards when you're going downhill, and you get all this banging, and we as young fellows thought that was a great show, you know, making all this noise. But the pursuit of that then came, you know, things came a little slower to the interior than they did, you know, they usually got developed down at the coast and so on. And of course, railroad logging down there demanded that air brakes and someone capable of understanding these things be in charge. And inspections, of course, were according to law, not necessarily always carried out. But that began to get adapted to trucks. And the first air brake systems were pretty elementary, and there were no safety factors in them, and if you broke an airline, goodbye. Grab your lunch bucket and bail out if you're still alive when you got to the end of the road, you know. But little by little, safety valves and so on, based on what worked on railroads, were put into effect, and for off-highway work, that is to say private roads in the bush and so on, where they used the big trucks, you had to have an air ticket. And I had one for quite a few years. I've let it lapse now. I don't need it anymore, but I still have my Class 1 license with air endorsement on it. But you had to be able to tell an examiner exactly how the whole system worked. And that was commonplace for quite a few years. And I begin to think that we're starting to lose that tendency now.
When did the air come in?
Well, air began to make its appearance here in the late 40s. And people thought, oh, that'll never work, you know, that's too dangerous. It's fine on the railroad where the tracks are nearly level, you know, and so on, but it'll never work on the highways. Airlines get torn off and all that. But it kept developing and so on till in the 50s it was commonplace. And it kept getting perfected, you know, to the point it's at now, where it's a pretty good system. And along with that, the parking brake apparatus was completely revolutionized. The original systems even had separate brake shoes for the parking brake from the foot brake mechanism. And all they were good for was so that when you once stopped the vehicle, you could set these brakes and it would, hopefully it would hold it. Well, then they found a far better device, they thought, where they put it on the drive shaft, where it had a great deal more purchase. And the original disc brake was used as a parking brake on the drive shaft, and it was terrific. You could pull up on that handle and tear the drive line right out of your vehicle. You know, it was so effective. But the problem then was that if you were sitting on icy ground, which was commonplace here for 4 or 5 months a year, one wheel, due to the differential in the rear axle, one wheel could start turning backwards and allow the other wheel to roll forwards. And the vehicle would just go down the hill or wherever it was going. So that device finally outlived its usefulness. And then they came to the maxi brake. And the maxi brake is a trade name which we use loosely to describe the spring-loaded parking brake, which is held off by air. And the minute you lose your air, it will go on. And to use it as a parking brake, all you do is simply exhaust the air out of it by pressing a button or pulling a button, whichever way it happens to work. And there's both methods used. And that exhausts the air, and the spring-loading device in there applies the regular foot brake. And your truck will sit because all wheels are locked up. And of course, all the proper functioning of this depends on everything being kept in order. Your linings, your drums, your adjustments, and so on. And up until I left the trucking business, inspectors were around rather frequently and would check you at weigh scales and see that these things were all working. And I think that's absolutely essential, because people like myself, and more so those who didn't own their own trucks, are usually in a hurry to get from A to B. And I know what it's like when you are traveling, we'll say from here to that big Grand Forks. You reach the top of the Blueberry Pulse and you are required to pull over into those areas and check your brakes. But if nobody's looking and you want to get to wherever you're going, be it Vancouver or wherever, well, there's nobody around, it's the middle of the night, who knows. I just checked my brakes yesterday, and so down the hill they go. And guess what? You get going down there, and as the brakes overheat, first thing that happens is the drums expand. The next thing that happens is that the shoes get so hot they slick up and don't want to grip. And then if they get beyond the travel limits of the air application of the booster, why then they don't touch the drums with enough pressure to retard the movement of the vehicle. And inside of the brake is a cam shaped like a figure S, and it works against two rollers. And as it spreads these rollers out and that cam turns around, that S can get standing so that the points of it are touching the roller. When you go to release the brake, it won't come off. It's now jammed there. And you see these big black marks every now and then from this kind of thing happening. If a person's brakes are not overheated but they are not adjusted properly and that happens, they get up on top dead center and they jam there. And I once rescued a military band who had this very thing happen coming off the Blueberry Paulson, beg your pardon, the Salmo Creston, in the winter, in December, about, must be 6 or 7 years ago. And luckily, their brakes, their vehicle, their own military vehicle, broke down in Cranbrook. So they rented a Greyhound bus and let their own driver take it with this band. And they got coming down there too fast and riding the brakes, and the brakes overheated, and the cams went up over center and stuck there. And he was just about at the bottom of the hill, and there was a big wide spot, and he pulled into that, and it stopped. And I came along, and it's stormy night, snowing and blowing, and here's these two fellas standing out on the road in big overcoats, and pitch dark, and I thought, my gosh, shall I stop or not? And finally I stopped, and 40 or 50 feet past them.
Was this with a load of logs?
No, I was coming in my car. So I opened the window a little bit. I didn't know who I was going to be talking to, but I thought, gee, a Greyhound bus. I could see when I went by that it was a Greyhound bus. should be all right, you know. So I opened the window a little, and they said, "Boy, mister, are we ever glad you stopped?" They said, "We're stranded here, you know." And I let them in the car, and then they told me their story. But they didn't know what had gone wrong. So I listened to them, and we're driving along towards Trail now, you know, because they had to get another bus, you see, to come back. And what they had done is when there was a creek nearby, so they had got water and everything and threw on these brakes, you see, which of course tended to contract them and make the situation even worse. Now they couldn't unhook those brakes to save their soul. And I said, "You're lucky you couldn't, because the next time you'd have come to a stop sign or something, you wouldn't have stopped. You'd have just kept going." And you're lucky. They were really lucky, you know, that this happened in the way it did. But there are a number of others that didn't happen, and the loads just got away on them. And when that Sawmill Creston Skyway was first built, there were quite a number of accidents, and they built the runaway lanes, which were frequently used. And strangely enough, not as many people were killed as there were accidents, but very fortunate in that respect.
How did they load the logging trucks when you were first using them?
Oh boy, you know, it's scary to think of it. You'd have a deck of logs above a bank, and they'd be held by chips and rocks and one thing and another, and you'd put what you called skids down, you know, from the bank onto your truck. And two men would get up there with peavies. And if you know what a peavy or a cant hook is, it's got a good husky wooden handle in it. And that winter that I got that job to haul logs to Waldy's, I had been playing hockey on New Year's Day, and I broke this bone in my wrist. Not knowing that I broke it, I thought I'd just sprained it, so I didn't bother going to a doctor. There was a big slough over there, and we had about an acre of nice clear ice, you see, and I fell backwards and broke this. Well, this job came up early in January to haul these logs, and I took the job, and I couldn't hold that peavy in my hand. I just couldn't do it. I had to lay the peavy in the crotch of my arm here, you know, and work it. And of course, like I say, you wore cork shoes, and you stood on this confounded skid. And you would start the log coming down, and you'd hold it at the bottom of your reach when you were down as far as your arms would go, and you'd hold it there. The other guy would jam his PV in and hold it up there, and you'd unhook yours, and he'd let it roll down, you see. Well, there's nothing in the world to stop this thing from slipping, you know. There's snowing and sleet coming down, and those skids are so slippery, and you get the first few logs on that way, you're still alive, and you start the next batch coming, you see. Well, that was one way of doing it. If you were doing that with logs, that was one thing. If you were doing it with 60-foot poles, that was another thing.
So you'd always have to have a bank above the truck?
Not always, but that was one way of doing it. Another way of doing it was it could be right on the level, you know, and I'm referring to the earlier days that I worked in it in the beginning, and that was a process that had been used for several years. It had been refined a little here and there. They would have log deck on the ground, level with the truck. You'd put skids up to the bunks. Mm-hmm. And you'd have a team of horses or something on the other side, and you'd have what you called a crotch line, which had two anchors, and you took it over there, and these logs were all laying on skids, so you could poke these cable or chain underneath this log and put it over top and hook on with the horse and just keep going, you know, and it would roll the log up onto the truck. And that worked pretty well, too. Then the gin pole. And the gin pole was a good sturdy pole, put in the ground, probably 30 or 40 feet long, you know, one end in the ground, and then they would have either stumps or whatever, which were usually lots of them around, you know, and cables, guy lines attached to these stumps, and a block and tackle up in the top, and one at the bottom. And the cable with a set of tongs on it hung down from this top block, and the cable came down through the bottom one, and off to the side would be either a winch of some sort or a team of horses, you know. And they'd go ahead and pull the log up in the air. There'd be a set of skids, and they'd pull them up on the air and drop them on the load. And that was further advancement, you know. And the knack was to balance the log properly with the tongs, and then they developed what they called pups. And this would be a crotch line that hung from this cable. Mm-hmm. Cable was suspended from the top block, and a ring in it, and then 2 short lines, and on the ends they started off with using the hooks out of a PV, and they'd have 2 of them, you see, and they'd just hook them in the end. And of course we're talking about short logs, you know, anywhere from 14 to 20 foot long. And you would hook them in the end of the logs, and as the team pulled, they would dig in. Well, of course, it didn't take long to realize that they'd dig in to the point where they'd split the log, you see, and come out when you had the worst time, you know. And so they put a big flat surface on them so that they could only go in so far. You see, and then they begin to shape them so they'd hook into the end of the log better, and really ingenious elementary kind of things, but they were well thought out and well designed, you know, and you could put a load of short logs on with those things so fast, you know. There was a rope extended from this hook out and a man on each end. And these were called bull ropes, and for good reason, because if you were, as years went by, loading on the side hill, the log decks would be below the road with one of these devices, and you could pick those logs up, and boy, you scrambled up that bank. But it was kind of pulling you, you know, but you put a load of logs on in 15 or 20 minutes, like nobody's business. And then the jammer came along, and that was a mechanical device, usually an old truck, a big sturdy truck, and what we called an A-frame, which was similar to a gin pole, except instead of 1 pole it had 2 of them, and I have some pictures of them around here. And that was sitting on a big timber, maybe 16 or 18 inches square across the frame of this truck and lashed down with clamps and so on. And then an engine-driven winch. And this winch usually had what we called a free-rolling drum. You had a friction device on there that you pulled the handle and engaged the drum and to the shaft and made it turn, and as soon as you let go of the handle, there was a brake you could put on, and if you let the brake off, that drum would roll freely. So these 2 men on the end of the bull ropes could run with that thing down the bank, hook another log, and then the engine would pull them back up and right up onto the truck, and the minute you slacked the load, you just pulled on the rope and it was free. And you standing on the ground could steer that log right into place. Oh, it was worked slick. That was they gradually put a single pole up instead of an A-frame, and a mast behind it, and that top end of that pole was guyed to the mast, and the mast was guyed to stumps around, you see, with little hand winches so that you could tighten them up, and that pole could swing maybe 30 or 40 degrees from center, and you'd tighten those winches so that the mast was leaning slightly to the side where the deck was, and or the load, whichever you wanted. And you could run down, hook the log. The weight of the log would cause the boom to swing over, and bring the log up right where you wanted it. But because the mast was tilted, when you got it up above the load, it would swing over center or even beyond center on the truck, so that you could position the log anywhere you wanted. And that really worked well.
Where did the ideas for these come from?
Well, I think everybody had a hand in refining somebody's basic idea. And these kind of things that after we got through using skidways, which were dangerous and hard work, when we got to using gin poles, then the jammers, I think the most of these ideas came up from Idaho and so on. Priest River was one of the places where some of these ideas that I worked around came up from there. The Skagit manufacturing company from somewhere down in Oregon, can't think of the name of the place right at the moment, but Sidro-Woolley, Oregon. They developed the single and double drum winches on a capacity suitable for this kind of work, and they were quite common around here. And you know, getting away from Babbitt bearings into roller and ball bearings so that the drums rolled freely and all that kind of stuff was a very important factor in making all these things work. And some huge old chain-driven trucks, you know, that had chain drive. were put to use. You know, they had huge, they even had solid tires on some of them, you know, and they were put to use for this purpose because they didn't move much. And if the engine in them was beyond, that is, the engine that propelled them along the road was beyond repair or something, they'd just tow it with a cat or something, a crawler tractor to its other location. But normally they had the engine working well enough that they could move from site to site. And my first experience with one of them was I worked from fall till spring in the Rogers Pass for the Rogers Lumber Company. And their headquarters were in Priest River or Spokane, probably. But they bought one of these jammers to bring in there to load logs. And it was on an ancient Mack truck chassis that had chain drive. And the differential for this truck was rigid right up in the frame. And the solid axle, which was similar to a trailer axle, was suspended on the springs, you see, at the back of the truck. And this big chain, big roller chain, ran from the differential back to this big sprocket on the inside of the back wheels, where normally the brake drums were. Well, the brake drums were there, but they had long since worn out. So they attached the foot brake rods to the parking brake mechanism, which was up on the differential. Well, then your braking effort depended on these chains. If they broke, you had no brakes. Well, I was just a young guy then and just married a couple of years and went to work for the Rogers Lumber Company, and my wife and I had a house up there that they built and so on, and they, in the spring of the year, they said, Bob, you go down to Cranbrook on the train, and there was no road into Rogers, no such Rogers Pass or anything in those days, 1944. And this jammer has been driven up from Priest River to Cranbrook, and you pick it up there and bring it to Golden and load it on a flat car and ship it into Rogers. And so I left Cranbrook early on a Sunday morning, and it was about, maybe 5 or 10 above zero. It had been a good heavy frost that night, and I had Mackinac. There was no cab or anything, you know, just this huge old vertical steering column, and this engine, the original engine had been replaced with something a little more modern, but it was still old too. And this chain drive apparatus, the brakes had been disconnected from the drive wheels to the differential brake. Really haywire. The springs had even disappeared from the release springs for the brake had disappeared. They'd used springs from a gopher trap in there, you know. You talk about a piece of machinery. Shouldn't have been allowed on the road, you know. Well, I got away up in the Golden in the Columbia River Valley there near Windermere somewhere, and there was an experimental farm. The road ran down alongside of this experimental farm, and the day is wearing on, you know. 20, 25 miles an hour was absolute maximum speed, you know, and I had a long ways to go. And I just couldn't see myself making it, you know, in that time. So came down around this experimental farm, and then there was a deep coulee, and they had cut away fill material from both sides on the top and filled in the bottom, so that the bottom fill was maybe 40 or 50 feet deep. But it was I'd say 1/8 of a mile down in there and out the other side, you know. Well, I thought, I got to make some time, so I put her in neutral. And I had all the rigging, you know, the mast and the boom and everything was let down. It was hinged, you see, and it was let down and lashed down and so on a big frame in the front bumper, and everything was really, you know, cables dangling, block and tackle, the whole works. And I start down this hill, and I begin to gain speed, and I was really going, and this thing was just shaking, you know, and there's no way in God's green earth I could stop it. Down in the bottom and up the other side, and I didn't dare reduce speed or I'd never make it up the other side, you know. Well, sir, when I was going full bore coming down into the bottom, one of these chains broke and came off. It just went whirring through the air, and it was total length about 8 feet long, you know, and about 2 inches wide. So there was quite a weight of chain there, single roller chain. That thing went whirring through the air, and I was going up the other side. Now I had no power, you see, because I had neither had brakes nor traction engine power. Well, I coasted up the other side into that cut, and there was no way I was going to make it over the top. So I ran it into the ditch on the right-hand side of the road, and there was a huge boulder, oh, the size of that hassock there at least. And I out of that thing and around back and grabbed this boulder and threw it behind one of the wheels, and it rolled back onto this and rocked there a couple of times, and there it sat. Well, I went back down and gathered up that chain and hauled it up the hill. I found an old gunny sack there I put over my shoulder, because it's covered with that black grease, you know, and I had a good Mackinaw on. And I packed it up there, and there was 2 kids playing in a field, and I could hear this swearing. And I thought, that can't be those kids. You know, there was a farmer's field adjacent there. Stubble, alfalfa stubble, hadn't started to grow yet in the spring. And they had a pet crow. And he had his wings clipped, so he couldn't fly, but he was hobbling through this stubble, and he was really cursing this stubble. And these kids were saying, "Shut up, Blackie, shut up," you know. And they came over to the fence to see what was going on there, you know. And I asked them if there was anybody around that had a blacksmith shop, and they said, "Yeah, that man down there, that farmer has one." So I down there, and he says, "Go ahead, help yourself." He was busy doing something else, and I found a forge and a anvil and drill press and the whole works, you know. Well, I didn't need the drill press, but I reshaped a couple of sections of this chain. There were several spare sections laying on the deck to make what they called a master link, you see, so that you could reconnect the chain, and fixed it up and got going again and got as far as Parson that night. But they were pretty haywire devices. And in fact, I think the term haywire stuck to me. For years I carried a roll of haywire on one of my trucks, and everybody used to give me a bad time about it, but they'd all come and cut a piece off, you know, to tie up some loose end or something. Yeah.
Did you work for Waldy for very long?
Actually, it was Tedesco's that were contracting, but it only lasted about 3 months until spring breakup. And by this time the war was on, you know, going full bore, and one of the Tedesco boys was taken into the service, and another one came along that was able to take over the job and so on. So I went from there into other similar jobs, you know, to try and get into the logging industry. My next episode with that was in Port Hardy. I couldn't get into the military because of one bad eye. I had lost the sight of an eye when I was 13, and so they was put me in Category C2, and everywhere I went, I either volunteered or I had to go there to get my registration card stamped. I think it's stamped 5 times, various places I went to get work, you know. And I worked for Boeing Aircraft briefly on Sea Island, building the Catalinas and or what we call the Cansos in Canada. But that didn't suit me, and I went to Port Hardy, and they were logging that area to build that airport. And I worked through logging stages on plank roads and over marsh and so on, which was a new experience for me. And then I went to Powell River for the Powell River Shingle Company. And that was a job hauling shingle bolts off the mountain. And that was something else. You know, the roads there were built out of poles instead of, bulldozers or anything, you know. And some places you were 60 feet in the air with no visible railing or anything, you know. They were just what they call a bull rail that ran down between the wheels, you know, and you rubbed up against that. And in the morning in a heavy frost, now, that was lots of fun. And I hauled there from October till August. And the fire season down there is so severe, due to, I guess, the humidity or whatever, that they shut everything down in the summer. And I came back to the Kootenays. By this time I was married and had a young son, 6 months old, and It was from there that I went to the Rogers Pass. From the Rogers Pass logging operation, which I left in May the following year, I came back to this area and went back to work for some of the people like Katie Lumber and Pole, Burns Lumber Company, and so on, that I had been acquainted with prior to leaving. And then I got working for Kootenay Forest Products with one of my own trucks. And they had given a contract over in the Crawford Bay area for some poles to some fella, and he got the poles made way back up in Crowsdale Creek, which was very steep, and then they couldn't get the poles out of there. They built a road and so on, but it had underneath this road a big rock face, and a wet spring, and the whole road slid down a couple hundred feet into Crowsdale Creek and disappeared, you know. So you know, $30,000 or $40,000 worth of poles lying there for a year, then the second year, and in an effort to get a job with Kootenay Forest Products, I had hauled for small contractors in the Lardo, but could never get on with them. They kept bringing in trucks from other places, such as around Mission and so on. And once these people got a stranglehold on the job, they held on to it. And I wasn't necessarily a good manager. I knew all about running the rigs and keeping them going and so on, but the business end of it was something I always thought somebody else looked after, you know, or just happened. And I was really pressuring Kootenay Forest Products for a job, and the woods manager of that day was a fella by the name of Al Larson, who has since passed away, but a pretty fine fella. And Al said to me, you know, Bob, he said, I just wish I had the say in who hires the contractors, but he said, I'm just looking after the woods operation. And he said, I'll tell you one thing, I have these poles over in the Crawford Bay area, and he said, if we don't get them out this year, we lose them. The worms will be in them, and that'll be the end of it. And he said, there's about $40,000 worth of poles. But he said they've got to be gotten down to the highway and over to Surdar, where there was a CPR siding. And at that point, he said, we'll load them on rail cars and ship them to Galloway in the East Kootenay for the pole treatment plant there. And in those days, they didn't have augers for drilling post holes or so on, as they do now. So they didn't mind if the pole butts were oversized. They could always either trim them or leave them the way they were. It just meant they had that much more good wood for whatever, you see. The pole was sold by its length, not necessarily by its thickness, but they were scaled and measured and categorized by their sizes of the butt and so on, so many feet up, whether they were a class 1, a class 2, and so on. And these were good poles. Crawford Bay was a wonderful pole country. And there were quite a number of 100-footers in this. Well, there was a logging road maybe 100 yards off to up above this, where these poles were, and it was built for hauling short logs. So you can imagine the switchbacks were not necessarily wide enough and round enough to get around with 100-foot poles. So he told me about this situation, and he said, we're desperate to get them out, and we've tried for 2 years and we haven't been able to succeed. So he said, if you want to go and look at that, he said, that's all we have right now. And you know, the trucking business, the way I managed it, why you needed to be working, as I didn't have any bank account to keep me going in the slack time. So I went over there, and I knew the contractor that had to get those poles down to the highway. He was a pretty good friend of mine. And I went to see, well, it was prearranged that I would meet him over there, and we went up and had a look, and we took a walking tour through there. When we came to this pole deck in this ravine, yes, there's room there, and they had a good jammer capable of loading these poles and so on, but there was, I'd guess a distance of 200 or maybe more, maybe, yes, good 200 yards where there was no road, just sheer rock face. This road had just slid away, you know. So the only way out was a skid trail that went up the mountainside to this logging road above. So we walked up there after we'd looked everything over. We walked up there and then started down the logging road and around these switchbacks. And at the first switchback, they had it intended to build the road straight on. So they had built it for maybe 100 feet and then stopped and decided to make the switchback. So that was suitable. So we walked down about a quarter of a mile or more down to the next switchback, which led up to where the poles were, and it was built in there for maybe 50 or 60 feet before it slid away. So that was suitable. So I said, well, if you supply the cat, we need the jammer, of course, and a D6 tractor, crawler tractor, to pull us out of here. And I came home, and it took 2 or 3 days, and I extended the reach on my truck to, when we normally had 20 to 22 feet between the bunks to haul logs. In those days were cut 30, 32 feet long. But for 100-footers, I extended the reach so that I had 42 feet between the bunks. Mm-hmm. Between the front bunk and the back of the cab, it was about 8 or 10. Well, between the front bunk and the front bumper was 20 feet. So that was 62 feet. So I still had 38 feet overhang at the back. And there was lots of 60s and 70s and 80s and so on, which we could load behind the cab. But we loaded all the 90s, 95s, and 100s over the cab, so that you had to build your load up high enough on the front so that the top logs, the long ones, went right over the cab roof and parallel with the front bumper. Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you that was no easy thing to build your load and put enough butts back and enough butts ahead to keep the load coming up level. And then if I didn't have enough, we had to put a spacer in maybe to get over the cab roof, you see. And then they had to be fastened down, and and they're springy, they bounce and spring all over the place. And it was the best place in the world to lose a leg or something in between those poles when you're walking on them up there. And now the first load, these were dry poles, and according to the scales that they had, we could haul about 21 to 2,200 lineal feet of poles and still be within the weight limits, because we had to cross scales at Yak. And there were several restricted bridges at Wardner and so on, you see, Kidd Creek, etc. To haul a 100-foot pole from Crawford Bay over that Lakeshore Road, I suppose you're familiar with it, we had to be past Sirdar and Windle by 6 o'clock in the morning off of that road. And then when we got to Yak, we couldn't leave there till the school buses were off the road that came in from Cranbrook. So we estimated that we had the right amount of poles on, and I got this first load down by being pulled up. I put a cable between the truck and the trailer, because you have a pin in the reach, and with that pin in there you can't turn, because the reach got to be able to compensate and so on. And I had built a special compensator and so on to give me an extra length, about 9 or 10 feet long. Luckily I had all this material laying around from previous experiences, And we fastened a cable between the trailer and the truck so it couldn't get away on us, couldn't slip back, and pulled the truck and trailer and load of logs, poles, up onto this road. Then unhooked the cat and got it out of the way, took the cable off, and just left it laying there for the next trip. Now I went down to the first switchback, and instead of trying to make it, I just went up into that road that they had attempted to build, and then backed that load of poles down to the next switchback. And there were times going around corners when you couldn't see the trailer. It was completely out of sight. And you're thousands of feet above Kootenay Lake. You could look almost into Nelson, And I'm no good at height, and there's only 2 or 3 feet of room to spare on each side, on either, divided between each side. So there was times when I would be out on the running board looking down underneath the load of poles, and the contractor that had to get the poles down, he would be down over the bank signaling me which way to turn to keep the trailer on the road. We got 14 loads of poles out of there that summer in 14 days. And there was times when we had to chop the first load, you know, we had to chop trees down and so on to get because those poles were swinging out 20 feet out to the side of the truck. When you were going this way, they were coming around over here, you know. And the back end was hanging up in the bank and making it hard to, you know. We got those poles out of there that summer. And instead of taking them to Yak, or to Sirdar and unloading them and then reloading them, I hauled them right through to Galloway, a trip a day. And we'd leave at 4:30 in the morning, be off the road at 6, have breakfast at Yak, and wait till supposedly 9 o'clock. All this written out on your permits. But we would have our breakfast. When I say we, I had to have a pilot car because of these long loads. And we'd leave about 20 minutes to 9 after a few trial runs, you know, and we'd arrive in Cranbrook right behind the school buses just as they were turning off the road. And I would arrive in Galloway right around 11 o'clock within 5 minutes every day at the same time, except if we had a flat, you know. And they'd get me unloaded by noon. My pilot car could leave right away as soon as it turned in the gate. He could turn around and go back, you know. And I would get back to Creston and gas up and go back to Crawford Bay and have a rest, and then go up in the bush just about quitting time, so that the logging trucks and everything were out of there, and then we'd put on another load of these poles and then come down out of there, you see, and park them for the night and leave again in the morning. And to get these permits, I got the commercial transport inspector for the area, who had a portable set of scales, to come over to Crawford Bay and weigh these. And we were within 700 pounds of being right on the nose with that calculation. So they never bothered us at the Yak scales, except for one instance. I think it was probably the second year that I hauled these poles, and the price of poles were so good that they wanted to get some fresh cut poles hauled. You see, you can only peel the cedar poles up till about July, and then the bark starts to stick as the sap dries up. But up until then, you know, you can take the bark at one end of that pole and just keep ripping it, and it'll peel right to the other end, you know, in big strips. So in the fall of the year, they wanted me to try and haul a load of unpeeled poles, and they'd put them through the mechanical pole peeler over in Galloway, you see. We did all right. We didn't put any hundreds or anything. We had 75s and 80s and so on, but unpeeled. And we put about 2,000 lineal feet on, and got to the weigh scales in Yak. And this is October, late October. I was 22,000 pounds overweight, 11 tons. Man. The guy in the weigh scale, he said, just park it over there. And he picked up the phone and he called the highway patrol. And I went out and I backed the truck off the scales and parked it over there, and there was a phone booth over there across the road. And I got on that phone, and we got a hold of the highways people and everybody else. Well, the Kootenay Forest got a hold of the Department of Highways district manager or regional manager, and there wasn't a great deal he could do, you know, he can't monkey with the law. But with a little appeasement and one thing and another, you know, they made a deal with the weigh scale people, who have authority over these things, that if I unloaded, I hadn't done any damage so far, and if I unloaded enough of these poles to make it legal, they would let me go. So I had a pilot car, and we went into a gravel pit and undid the wrappers and so on, and used the wrappers to tie to a tree, and we pulled a third of the load off. And just pulling ahead and backing up and pulling ahead and backing up, one or two poles at a time. And then went over the scales, and I was close. So they said, okay, away you go. Well, I'm telling you, we had to, by this time we had to stay overnight in Cranbrook, you know, and so on, and that was it for the poles that winter. There's just no way we could make it go hauling that small a load. So those poles lay there all winter, and the next year I started hauling, you know, in the spring of the year, hauling the regular peeled poles again. Well, I still had to get that load, or a third of a load, back on the truck. Well, during the winter months, there was a slack period. I think there was a strike or something on. And I went up to Prince George and hauled logs up there. And I would haul all week. You know, they wanted to haul day and night. But I would haul, day and night hauling, they haul 5 loads. And I would haul 3 by myself and get 4, 5, 6 hours sleep and then go again, you see. And so by golly, I'd haul 1 load on Saturday and then go into town, do my laundry, buy whatever things I might need for the truck and so on. And in the process, I was coming out with a load on a Saturday forenoon, and there was lots of moose on the road, and the snowbanks were 10 or 12 feet high, you know, and just like solid ice, basically like a bobsleigh run, you know. And you just herded your truck down between these snowbanks. You really didn't have complete control when you are on the level. And you'd be going down through these gullies and up the other side, you know, and I come up and there was a straight stretch for a mile or so, and I see this black object down the far end, and I thought it must be some moose, you know, so I thought, well, when I get close, I'll, you know, then the moose like to stay on the hard road. They didn't want to go out in the deep snow. It wasn't moose. It was another trucker, and he had a self-loading trailer drawn up by a engine-powered winch on the back of the cab, you see, and up a couple of ramps at the back. But this winch brake was slipping a little, and the trailer would gradually move back, you see, and every now and then he had to engage the winch and pull it back up again. Well, he was coming along that road trying to make his second trip on a Saturday morning, and he turned his head to see if the trailer was slipping down, and in the process he turned the steering wheel a little bit, and he was up into that snowbank, and he was buried. You see, the heat of the vehicle and so on, it just sunk into this snow. Well, that chap, he was a little older than I, lived just east of Creston in the Arrow Creek area. And he was just driving for another trucker in Prince George. Well, I had a cable wrapped around my bumper. I was the only trucker there with a 3/4 inch cable about 20 feet long with an eye in each end. And I hooked on, and we pulled his trailer off and parked it. And then we just kept bumping and bumping till we pulled the truck out of the snowbank and onto the road. And the engine had stalled. We had to prime the fuel system. It was a Detroit diesel. We got that going, and we got his trailer loaded, and he said, "Bob, I don't know how I'm ever going to pay you, you know." And I said, "Oh, someday you might help me, or you might help somebody else. That's the way it goes in trucking." Well, here I am with these poles laying in this gravel pit over there, and I got to get them out of there. It's my last trip in the fall, the year later. And I knew where he lived, you know, so I dropped into his house, and I was coming by empty one afternoon. And his wife said, "Well, he's not here, but he'll be here tomorrow afternoon, and I'll tell him you want to see him." So the next day, I think it was a Friday, I arrived and dropped down there to see him, and he says, "What can I do for you?" And I told him about these poles. He said, "When do you want to move them?" And I said, "Monday. I'll be coming through with my last load, and I want to clean them up. I'll be there." And we used this cross-haul system. He cut some skids, and he got some cables, and he brought one of his little old single-axle logging trucks that he had sitting in the yard over there. And we took the extensions out of my stakes, and we cross-hauled those poles up onto a load. And the weigh-scale operator sat and watched us do all this, you know, and my son was pilot carring for me at the time. And we got all these poles up on there and tied them down and so on, and, you know, I says, "Now what do I owe you?" He says, "Well, I guess we're square." Can you imagine? All the way from Prince George to Yak, you know, what a coincidence.
Yeah.
kind of things, you know. You just can't believe what happens in one area and how it can be related to something that'll happen 1,000 miles away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just before you turn the tape back on, I'll tell you when we left off there.
Why did you want to work for KFP so bad? I mean, what was that the only company that was hiring then? Or?
No, but they were a well-organized company, pretty steady work, and they had a good system. I had hauled for smaller operators in the Lardo, and I'd seen their operation. I was familiar with the Lardo in as much as I had been there in 1939, and the main haul road was the old railroad grade. No hills, except when you went up into the bush. And when we turned off to the left at Girard, you went in on the, well, if the valley runs east and west, that would be the north side of Trout Lake, the shores, and there was a creek called Craig Creek and Benson Creek, and there was a family of Craigs had a sawmill up in there at one time, and remnants of that were still kicking around there in the bush. In fact, a fellow by the name of Craig became a salesman for the Hayes Truck Company and manufacturing, and came to see me and told me this, you know. But they kept their roads pretty good, you know, and after that pole haul, I became truck number one for KFP. Oh. And then this same John Murray sent for me one time, and leading up to that, I got ahead of myself a bit there. Norman Johnson was the mechanical superintendent for KFP, and Norman had grown up a few miles down the road here, and he and I were quite well acquainted, and we were probably two of the local Anglophones that had learned to speak Russian fairly well, you see. Norman especially was very good at it. So he and I would have our brief introductions always in Russian, you know, and so on, and get into these things, and we'd have some good laughs and so on. And he's a few years older than I am, but he was in charge of the mechanical maintenance there, and I approached him one time about some work during spring breakup, and he said sure. And he put me in charge of rebuilding 4 of their trucks, their Kenworths, right, from bumper to tail light. Mind you, the engines didn't need to be rebuilt, but they needed tuning up, and the transmissions had to come out, and the clutches had to be inspected, and all the gear train all the way down, driveline, steering, spring hangers, the whole bit. And he had 2 or 3 other mechanics. When I took these components out of these trucks, I turned them over to them. They would go through them, turn them back to me, I'd put them back in, and the driver stayed with me, and we worked this, we did all the other work, like universal joints, spring shackles, and kingpins, and brake linings, and everything complete. So those trucks went back out in first-class shape, you know. When we got through, Norman took me in the office and he said, you know, Bob, I allotted so much for each truck. And he said, you were over on some and under on the other, and he says, we're within $2,000 or $3,000 of being right on where we wanted to be when we started out. And so I was still working around there, doing other jobs, and one day he came in and he said, they want to see you up in the office. And they had 6 of these trucks, 4 Kenworths and 2 Pacifics, and the 2 Pacifics were newer ones, so we didn't rebuild them that year. But they found it difficult to allocate the trucks to this designated areas on a regular basis. They were always either changing, you know, moving from site to site, which meant longer or shorter hauls, less time traveling or more time traveling. So they wanted somebody who could be free to go wherever they sent you during the middle of the day. They could say when you're coming in with a load, when you dump this load, go to such and such a machine. They need a truck there. And they wanted one truck that could go anywhere. So they wanted me to buy one of their trucks. This was a deal that John Murray and Al Larson put together an idea, so they wanted me to have a look at this deal. And it would mean a small cash payment on the truck, and then you would pay for it by the logs you hauled. You know, so much a unit would be charged back to the company for the payment of the truck. So I took that job on. Now, of the 4 trucks that we'd rebuilt, they had some drivers who were just born to drive truck. And those are the trucks that cost the least to rebuild, you see. Lots of the parts were, after examination, were in excellent shape and went right back in. There were 1 or 2 fellows who were there as by seniority, who were truck drivers, all right, but they were the truck drivers in name only, maybe you could say. And if the book said you press the clutch pedal in, you move it into this particular position of the gear shift, and then you let the clutch out, that's just what they did. And so there was a lot of wear and tear. And they're the trucks that definitely cost the most. So when they asked me, they said, all right, we make this deal. Now, which of the trucks would you take? And I said, oh, I'll take, I forget the number, 262 or something. Well, okay. So that's the truck I got. And after the deal was signed and sealed and delivered, now what made you pay 262? Because that's not necessarily the best driver that had that truck. I said, that's right. And that's the truck I put the most new parts in. And I remember John Murray saying, yeah, I knew there had to be a reason. He said, yeah, and it served me well, that truck.
But you had owned trucks before that?
Yes, I had gone through, I had 2 trucks before that. I still had my second one, which was a Mercury logging truck, but it was just at the time when diesels were becoming more popular. Not the reason because they didn't need to go to diesels, it was because, first of all, they were having development problems with diesel engines. They were functioning pretty well, but I mentioned to you earlier about going downhill with a gasoline engine, and the vacuum holds you back. Now, you would think in a diesel engine where there is no air shutoff, in a Detroit there is, but that's an emergency thing to shut that engine off if nothing else will. In a Cummins and Caterpillar and normally with a Detroit diesel, you didn't shut it off by cutting off the air, you shut it off by cutting off the fuel. But there are situations that can develop when you're running out of fuel that the engine will take off and run away on you. And particularly in a Detroit diesel, and so they had this air shut off so that it would create vacuum in there and shut the engine down by slow the RPMs down and eventually stall it. When you were going down long hills, and no holdback power on this diesel engine, because you created compression when the piston's coming up, and that same compression drove it down even if you shut the fuel off. You see, there was no vacuum in there. And so then they developed the Jacobs brake, the Jacobs engine brake, which allowed that compression developed on the upstroke or compression stroke. That Jacobs brake mechanism popped the exhaust valve open right at the time when the injector should fire. And they combined the compression and injection, fuel injection power stroke escaped out the exhaust. And that's what makes them so noisy. It's escaping right at the maximum peak of compression out through the exhaust, you see. And there's no push down on the piston. So now they'd found a way of turning the engine into a compressor. And so that held you back quite effectively going down hills. But the original design shut the fuel off completely. So that there was no fuel going through the injector. And that made it really hold back. But the fuel that went through the injector cooled it and lubricated it. And they are so finely honed that even your fingerprint on the injector push rod will cause it to seize up. That's how fine they're made. So they found that in no time at all they were having injector problems because there's no fuel going through them. So much so that the Cummins people said that if you use a Jacobs brake on our engines, we'll void the warranty. So then the injector people, the head of who was Crescent L. Cummins, whether there was any relation to them or not, I don't know, but they designed the idea then that they come up with the idea that they would allow the idle amount of fuel to go through the injector at all times, and that saved the day for them.
Huh. And that kept it lubricated.
Yeah, that kept it lubricated and cooled, you know.
So you had bought an international truck.
An international tandem truck down in Vancouver.
And what year was that?
59.
Was that before you did the pole job for Kate?
Yes. Yeah, this led up to that pole job.
Okay.
And I worked for a while in the Lardo, hauling some pine logs out of an area that had been infested with bugs, you know, up there. I also hauled some out from around Riendell and so on. And I realized I had to get into the long log situation, which meant buying a trailer. You couldn't carry on doing this short log operation. Mm-hmm. Those people like Terry Whitelock, Haddocken Brothers, Gordon Burns were pretty well going out of the short log business, you see. So I went to the coast and bought this trailer and came back here, and I started hauling logs up in the Lardo with this apparatus. And of course the truck had seen better days, but it still was, you know, I managed to keep it in good shape, and it was still getting its trips in and so on, but underpowered, you see, and slow. And when you got on the long steep hills, you had to put a water tank on and haul water up to cool the brakes coming down. Otherwise you could be in big trouble. So I wound up in Burton, hauling out of Rod Creek, and it was a long hill down out of there, and we could make 2.5 trips a day, get loaded at night and go early in the morning, or go down after supper and get 3 trips and so on. And you were hauling a ton of water back up the hill again from the watering hole, which would maybe be a third of the way up, you see. And that slowed you down and all the rest of it. So I could see that this was coming to an end, you know, I was going to have to do something. And I started looking around, and finally I located a Mercury logging heavy truck chassis in Vancouver, brand new, 1963. And I thought, you know, about going diesel, and that was another $8,000 or so more. A diesel truck in those days, you know, 25 for a used one and over 30,000 for a new one. And boy, they had their problems. So I went down to Vancouver and looked at this Mercury, and at first they said, oh, it's not for sale. It's already committed to somebody. But the manager said the first person with the money gets this truck. So I talked to them, and I brought my truck down and showed it to them. And I wanted so many thousand for that one. And this truck, they wanted $19,000 for it. And boy, it was well built. And it had a gasoline engine in it that the Ford company had developed, called the Cleveland motor, to power the tanks in Korea, because the diesel engines' exhaust smoke gave away their location, and the enemy could attack them with artillery, you see. So they developed this plant to build this engine, and now they were in the domestic market with it. And it was a terrific engine for a gas engine, but the truck really should have had a good diesel engine in it. It was the chassis and everything would accommodate that. Well, anyway, I made a deal with the Ford people to install what was known as a Thompson retarder. And this was a hydraulic retarder that weighed about 85 pounds. And it had a turbine in it, much like a torque converter in a normal automatic transmission, which worked in reverse. And you could apply oil pressure to it to slow it down. It tried to pump this oil out through an orifice, you see, and the harder you applied the oil to it through air pressure. You had a control on the steering and an oil reservoir, and there was gauges on there to show you what air application you were giving, what oil pressure you had, and the temperature of the oil. And the oil was taken through some high pressure hoses to the bottom of the radiator where there was a heat exchanger mounted. And I had a bumper for a Hayes truck welded to the Ford bumper that was on this truck, and accommodated this heat exchanger in that bumper. I can tell you there was never any snow on that bumper. It would run that oil pressure up to a temperature that nearly 300 degrees, and your engine cooling that would keep your engine temperature right up to 190, 200 degrees all the time, coming downhill, which was good for the engine because then the parts didn't contract due to the cold. With the vacuum retarding effort of the engine plus this thing, man, I had it made. I could go to Burton and haul logs without bothering with the water. I cut the sides out of my water tank and used it to hang my cinches and wrapper cables in. And I relieved myself of at least a ton of water that I was packing. I got on a log haul in Thai that was 18 miles from the top of the hill down to the landing. And I could saunter down there in third gear. And the guys with the diesel trucks that, like at that time, they had no adaptation for a Jacobs brake on a Mack truck, none whatsoever. And they had to rely entirely on their brakes. And when I'd get down to the landing, their brakes would just be smoking. I could smell them for 2 or 3 miles before I'd get to the landing. And they were just getting their wrappers off, and here I come. Normally they should be on their way back up, and they hadn't even started to unload. And I'm right there. Oh, that thing, I ran that truck 85,000 miles, hauling logs and poles in Crowsdale Creek was the first pole haul I did with that truck. And never relined the truck brakes in 5 years. Never relined the truck brakes. Relined the trailer brakes.
The retarder worked.
Yep, the retarder worked so well. And it was so gradual that it wouldn't throw you into a skid. If you're coming down a steep hill with a load of logs, or even on the highway, especially on the highway, and you put your jake on quickly, it'll start your wheel sliding. But this thing came on gradually, and you could accelerate against it. Whereas with a Jacobs brake, if you accelerate, you cut it out right away, immediately. And I'm not saying that the Jacobs brake isn't a good rig. It is a good rig. But this thing was, in some respects, even better, and absolutely silent. You didn't know when it was on or off as far as noise was concerned. And once you got used to it, why, you could work that thing so that if you were coming up to a stop sign going through a town, you would put it on ahead of time, just, maybe 50 feet before you got to the stop sign. You just put it right on full. And it would take a moment or two, and then it would come right on, and it'd just pull you right up like that, and you'd just knock it off just as you came to a stop. It wouldn't stop you. It'd bring you down to about 5 miles an hour, and then it lost its effectiveness. And you just touch the brake and you were at a standstill. And I'm telling you, I never saw another one like it. I know another person tried it. He heard about it, and he tried it on a diesel truck, but his water pump wouldn't cool it fast enough to be effective. And that was something that, an experience I had that I never, get tired of talking about, because with these big B trains and so on that are now functioning on the highways, hauling whatever, chips or beer or whatever, they are still battling with this problem of brakes on these long hills like we have in BC here, starting from Crescent to Hope. You go over summit after summit, and they'll be coming down those mountains. You watch them, they're coming down about 5 miles an hour, all the way down, and that takes them a long, long time to come 20-odd miles down those hills. but they don't dare let them go, or their brakes will just give out on them and they'll be gone, because they can't hold them with the engine.
So you've driven logging trucks right through the whole West Kootenays then?
Yeah, I was mentioning to somebody that I've hauled logs down around Nelway at the border, and in Giscombe and Mackenzie, west of Prince George, and at Port Hardy, and over around Field. Mm-hmm. I had a haul one time hauling from Field to Parson, and yes, scattered right around the province, but extensively in the Kootenays here. Mm-hmm. You know, almost everywhere I go, I look up a mountain and say, well, I've hauled out of that clear cut or whatever, you know, and I was not totally aware of what was happening for a number of years, so busily involved in the trucking end of it that I didn't realize what the clear cutting was doing to our areas, you know. And then after a while, I began to take note of what was going on around me, and I used to start it off by saying, you know, where do the birds and the bees and the chipmunks and the bears and everything go when we've finished this area? And they keep moving over, and the deer and so on. And then the next thing I noticed in the spring of the year, when I was going down the road, the creeks were bringing the mountainside down with it, right alongside of me, and into the rivers and so on, and that earth that took who knows how long to create up there was coming down the mountain in a big wash, you know. And I began to get so aware and concerned about this that, not that in itself, but it was a big concern to me, and it was becoming a matter of conscience with me that we were doing this to our countryside, you know. And this mountain here has been logged 3 times. The original logging that went on prior to my time, and twice since I've lived here. My first job was in 1940 hauling logs out of there, and then back here in the 60s or 70s there was a little, in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a little sawmill operated up there and sawed logs straight up there, you know. So in my estimation, it doesn't have to happen. And it's very detrimental to the landscape when it does happen on these steep slopes, and we have, you know, just innumerable springs and so on, watersheds in these mountains. And I think water, more than anything, is necessary for us to survive. And if we don't have water, what good is the commerce, you know, and the political approach to it? Well, the jobs, Bob, the jobs. Yes, the jobs are important to the whole process, but I think that the fact that we are overloading the garbage dumps with the products that are manufactured from our forest industry is an indication that we don't need to be logging at the pace we're going at, because we've created a whole new industry in disposing of these goods in garbage dumps and landfills and so on.
Have there been particular times in your career where you've noticed a great increase in the amount of logs being hauled out?
Oh, I can hardly believe it, you know. In 58 through into the early 60s, it seemed to me that they were going crazy. And then that seemed to decline, and we're back into it again now. And what seems to be happening now is, of course, you got to watch how your thinking goes, because here, for instance, the amount of chips and lumber that are being hauled out by the train is declining rapidly, and It's my understanding that the railroad people are not doing anything to promote it, to help their end of it. You would think that they were suffering at the coming of the trucks. That's not the case. They are purposely trying to get out of hauling the material out of here so they can lift the rails here and discard this branch line. And this branch line was started in 1894 and completed in 1897 into Slocan. And it is what helped build this area. And our roads are not built to handle that traffic, but that's what's being asked of it. And we as taxpayers now have to support the roads. We've always supported the railroads with subsidies of one sort or another, and the railroads have done well besides that. But they want to get rid of these branch lines. There's considerable maintenance needed, you know, and so on. But it is the prime mover of heavy material, and it is by far the best system. And it's not as though technology didn't follow through. We have departed from the steam engine and so on, just as we've departed from the steam donkey and the bush and the oxen and what have you. And trucks certainly have improved, but the roads haven't. The roads haven't kept pace. And the railroads are still, the rail bed is still capable of handling the most modern locomotion that they've got. And it is far superior to what we used to have. And now with the other technology of two-way radio and so on, they can control that train. The sidings are here. It's not as though they had to redevelop and rebuild as we're going to have to do with the roads. Yeah. But we had a decline in the early 80s in our economy, and there was a period leading up to that decline, you know, when people became conscious of the fact that things weren't happening as we hoped they would do, you know. The economy was declining and things were going backwards. And when I heard a man like Bill Bennett, who was premier of the province, and so private enterprise oriented, say that the sawmill companies didn't have to cry. They just had to put some of their money back into their equipment. Their mills had gone, they were still back in the horse logging days. Big belts, flat belts, and all that, you know, when you could have rebuilt the mill. Instead of just patching and catching and trying to keep abreast, they needed to rebuild. Well, that's true. Something like that needed to happen, or should have happened. But when I heard him say that, then I knew it was in bad shape, because I wasn't his supporter, politically speaking. But when I heard him say that, then I knew things had to be bad, because the forest workers had been saying it for years, you see, and nobody had been listening. And when I could go to work in Crawford Bay and haul logs for Creston sawmills from Crawford Bay to Creston, 40-odd miles, 45 miles thereabouts. And then Kootenay Forest asked me to haul a load of logs from off the Skyway back to Crawford Bay. Can you believe that? I'm hauling a load of logs over to Creston, unload and go up the Skyway about 15 miles and load a load of logs and come back down almost into Creston and turn and haul those logs to the log dump at Crawford Bay.
So you had a load going both ways?
Load going both ways. And when I got that permit, the not the commercial transport, but the motor vehicle branch said, this is the first one of those kind of things we've ever issued. You know, and I'm hauling for two separate outfits in both directions. Now, that can only happen in a time of affluence and total disregard for economics. I was peeling rubber off of that truck around those roads so that I could almost daily see the difference in them. You know, when you skid a tandem truck around those corners all day long, loaded both ways, it's one thing to be coming back empty, but it's a different thing going both ways loaded. And the fuel you're burning and so on, of course I was earning money, but look at what we were doing to our resources and so on. And if you couldn't haul those logs from off the Skyway into Creston and off the mountain down to the log dump and leave that 40-odd mile strip right out of the picture. And I brought this up at one of these meetings where they had all the village councils and lumbermen and other manufacturers at this meeting, you know, and everybody sat there with sort of a blank look, who's this guy, what's he talking about, But that's a fact, and it's going on right here. There's loaded logging trucks going this way and loaded logging trucks going that way. Not the same ones, different trucks hauling for different outfits, over as far as Fruitvale and so on to the various outfits, and to Kolesniko's or to West Star, and hauling up there to Slocan. And
but when you first started, they must not have been working very high up in the mountains then. Has the elevation climbed up as you've over the years?
Oh yes. Yes, the roads have gone back and back and back, and they would have road building programs in the 50s, and the 60s, new what would you call it, legislation was put through, in the forest ministry to help finance the building of roads to keep abreast of the demand. Mm-hmm. As they got into the world market, they began to really make a big impact on the coast logging. At one time, they thought that 3/4 of the logging, they estimated, was done at the coast, and the lumber market was down there. I guess in the 60s, it was about half and half, between counting the northern interior as well as the southern interior. And not so much maybe in the northern interior. They certainly had to build roads, but it wasn't the kind of terrain there is here. And the timber up there was smaller, generally speaking. There was pockets of good timber up there too that I run into, but the method of handling it was skidders, and they loaded them branches and everything, and hauled them out of the bush. When I was hauling here in the beginning, I saw logs loaded out where 3 we made a load. Mm-hmm. But we figured 12, 14, 16 logs was a beautiful load of logs. Then it came to 20, and then it came to 30, and then 50 and 60, where you quit using the accepted means of heel booms and so on that picked up 1 or 2 logs at a time, and you started using grapple loaders that just gathered a whole bunch of them at one time and put them on your truck and shook them a little and so on and got them to fall into place. And so 50 and 60 logs to a load was nothing, and it's still that way. And I turn my head every time I see a load going by that looks like it's got about 20 or 25 logs on it, because that's not that common. And the number of areas that they are going into, private and crown land, and just clear cutting them and just getting them out of there, definitely the volume of logs that are leaving the country are multiplied several times over what they were in my time.
I'd been reading in some of the old newspapers from the Kootenay Lake area and looking for references to the sawmilling, and in one place they talked about log shortages in the early days. The techniques for logging restricted the areas that they could go into. And so they had, around one particular mill, they had logged off all the easily accessible timber, which would be that on the slopes above the lake. And it shut down because there was no more wood for them to get. This was at the turn of the century. I wonder if there have been other times during your career where the timber supply has been pushed to the limits, and then there was a change in operations that made new areas become accessible.
Yes, a change in operations and changes in other areas, other factors, as I said, legislation. The issuance of tree farm licenses. Mm-hmm. That was designed to guarantee an established mill perpetuity. Mm-hmm. And I suppose it filled the bill to some extent. But that granting seems to me it in itself needed regulation, so that the small operator could get some timber to keep going on. That was a big battle for a long time. And that was answered to some degree by portable mills, so that rather than bring timber to the mill, they moved the mill to the timber. And Well, those were usually small operations, and I suppose you got to take into account too the manpower situation. If a mill became established in the area, we'll start with, we'll say, the Burns Lumber Company set up in Passmore, and the Burns people, speaking personally, were people who seemed to me to have a real desire for the community to survive. And yes, they had camps out in the bush, and I lived in some of them. You'd go out there on a Sunday night, and you'd come back in the beginning on a Saturday. You worked 48 hours a week. You'd work an extra hour Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so you could get home. You'd leave the camp at noon, you'd have your lunch and head for home, you see. And they'd haul you down in a big truck with a big rack on it like cattle, you know. But that was, you had to tarp over it, and away you'd go. And that had to be kept in mind, that once the place became established, there was no big hurry to move it. And then the communities began to grow up around it as the mill developed, you know, and people worked there, and commuting became an accepted way of working. The crew went out to the bush every morning and home every night. And so the community in itself didn't want to see the mill leave. The portable mills began to diminish in this part of the country, for sure, because they couldn't cut enough lumber in a day to pay for the kind of equipment that was needed to do the logging, because there were big logs in those days, and you just couldn't keep abreast with horses any longer. And you can go back in the bush here and see, maybe not now, but I remember when I worked for Burns, I was swamping in the bush for teams of horses that were logging in areas where the Patricks logged. And the butt logs that the horses couldn't pull out were still laying in the bush, 4 and 5 feet through. And they'd chop them off 16 feet long and couldn't move them, leave them there. They didn't. So logging methods have changed, and we went through the early mechanical means, but now that has been perfected. And another step that was made that helped accommodate the situation in this area is the advent of the small, reliable crawler tractor that didn't require such a wide skid trail up the mountain, didn't do the damage. You took a D6 up there and you built the road with a D8. Imagine the amount of earth that it moved around, and the amount of timber that had to be felled to accommodate the road. Skid trails by these smaller crawler tractors got around and everywhere, and they went through between the trees and the stumps and so on, you know, and they became very popular, still are. Yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit more about the Burns operation?
Yes, I suppose I could. You know, they had, my knowledge of them as a youngster was that they had a building supply operation in Nelson, and Burns and Company, and it was brothers and their families, and of course time goes by, the families grow up, and the youngsters got to have something to do, you know, and they're involved in this business. So it's my understanding that that's how the Burns Lumber Company then got established. And I can't really define where the difference was between Burns Lumber Company and Passmore Lumber Company. It seemed to me that the Passmore Lumber Company came about later, I suppose, to separate it from, as the older people moved out of the business and the younger ones took over. Some of them held on to the building supply company, others onto the lumbering industry, you see. And my acquaintance with the older Burnses, Harry Burns and John Burns, was simply tagging along with my father when he would be talking to them, you know. I'm not sure which family was which, but I understand that Gordon Burns, who I became quite well acquainted with, had a brother Bill, and he stayed in the building supply business, and Gordon came out here and developed this mill here at Passmore, steam powered, and it functioned you know, quite well by my standards anyway, of what I knew about it. and certainly produced a lot of lumber. It wasn't a modern mill as today's standards go, but it was fairly modern for that time.
Which would have been?
Well, I'm talking about the 1940s, and the demand that came about as a result of the war made some of these things happen. The demand for lumber for shipping and crating and so on was terrific, and housing projects such as they developed at the coast and other places, you know, wartime housing, and barracks, etc., military barracks and so on, and tremendous amount of lumber used up in those projects. But the Burns people logged in the Passmore area and developed roads and hauled logs out by truck. First of all, short logs with single axle trucks and trailers, and then it grew to using tandem trailers behind single axle trucks, and then using tandem trucks and trailers. And another thing that happened in that time was that when you scaled logs by the small end. This was before they came into the cubic measure. So if you scaled a log that was 16 feet long, it might have been 2 or 2.5 feet or whatever in diameter at the small end. And except for the butt logs, there would be very little taper in 16 feet. But you would get some free wood because of that taper. But you slabbed that log as a 16-footer, and the slab had to go the full length, as you can understand. But when they started hauling 32s and then to 48s, you still scaled on the small end. And you might have had a 1-foot log on the small end and 2 feet on the other end. And when you cut that into 16-footers, you got considerably larger amount of wood that wasn't scaled. And that's what brought the forestry around to the point of devising the cubic measure, where you scaled both ends of the log, and then converted that to cubic measure. And then in turn they converted that to weight, so that the trucker could get paid. Shouldn't talk with my hands. And that was a big change in the logging operation. And
before that, then you would bring your load down into the yard, and it would be split out and hand scaled?
Yes, it would be hand scaled, generally speaking. A lot of controversy over that between the contract haulers and the logging companies. When we speak of logging companies, the logging operation was usually run by the sawmilling, and so it would be called a lumbering outfit or whatever, you know. But they would scale the load either in the water where you dumped it or on dry land. And then with the advent of stakes on your logging trucks attached to the ends of your bunks and so on, there was a maximum height at which you were supposed to load. The stakes were cut so that the top of the stake was 12 feet from the ground. That's the maximum allowable. For cedar, they allowed you another foot because it's usually lighter. So you could go 13 feet high with cedar and 12 feet high with anything else. Well, whoever complied with that? You had to cut your stakes down 6 or 8 inches to keep those heel boom operators from putting another tier of logs above your stake, or at least a half a log. And if you had 2-foot logs, you were a foot over height and way overweight. Oh, thousands and thousands of pounds overweight. Well, when bridges started collapsing and whatnot on these back roads in these rural areas such as the Lardo, etc., which did happen, and right here on the Slocan River, they began to clamp down on this. And those of us who didn't want to get caught in that kind of a bind would cut our stakes down a little so that the guy couldn't go beyond a certain amount above the stakes, you see, and you try to stay legal. And then with the coming of scales, portable scales mounted right on the truck, so that you had kind of a computerized apparatus there, and you could a set of airbags that you inflated under the bunks and lifted the bunk off its normal seat, and as the load built up, it depressed these airbags, which in turn registered on a scale, on a readout. And then you were able to tell reasonably well how much you had on, so that you weren't forever running into trouble, because they began to up the penalty for overloading to so much a pound. And man, it was worth your life to get caught with a load like that, you know, hauling in rural areas. You get in the habit of wooding her up, and the next thing you know, here's the highway patrol. And boy, you would see guys going down every backwoods trail and everything to get off the road. Yeah.
That was, I mean, you were paid by how much you hauled, so the more you could load, the...
Yes. And then I was coming to that point where they then begin to say, well, so much a load. Well, some guy would have bunks 6 inches higher off the ground than the other guy, and the stakes were the same height, the top limits. So he was hauling 6 inches less wood every load, and he was getting the same amount of money as you were getting. And so that began, a point of contention. And finally, when they put scales in the mill yard, then you drove in over the scales, and they had a conversion factor. And every so often, about every 9 or 10 or so loads, you never knew which load it was going to be. And when it came up on the chart, this load goes over there, and you dump it. And the scalers were there and hand scaled it, 2 men as a rule. I went down each end of the row of logs and scaled them, and they corrected the conversion factor according to these sample scalings. And if you were hauling out of an area where there was a lot of heavy wet hemlock, that would cause a conversion factor change in one direction. And if you got into another area where was a bunch of dry spruce, well, they'd have to go back, and you may get caught hauling some heavy loads out and not getting paid the full weight, but when you got into the dry, you maybe still were working on the other one, and so it worked out. It was constantly being refined that way, and I think probably the best process they've come up with so far. It's so fine-tuned that now the lumbering companies are insisting that the loggers cut those logs to length within 2 inches, so that there isn't that waste slab of wood comes off the end of a log when the lumber goes through the mill. You see. And then, of course, working in conjunction with pulp mills so that the extra wood goes through chippers and off to the pulp mill, well, that's helping properly utilize everything, you know. And when I say helping to properly utilize, I realize that some things are being done right. But here and there along the way, I still maintain that we are just exhausting the forest industry or the forest resources to satisfy a gluttonous market in big cities like New York and Chicago and wherever. But I want to get back to the Burnses. I said earlier that they were very community oriented, and I thought so. They hired everybody they could from the community, you know, and if the logging was seasonal, which it was, you couldn't log in the spring of the year, you couldn't haul, thaw made the roads just a quagmire, and to my knowledge, they were very accommodating to the farmers that they had to go around and what have you. Gave everybody an opportunity to sell produce to the mill camps, and I'd like to relate one little experience when we were having a debate over the development of a high school in the area. And we've had this thing come to roost on us here in the last 3 or 4 years, where the people in the education field of politics are regulated to a great extent by how many votes they have, you see. And this school district number 8 had 5 trustees in it. There's Slocan area, New Denver, Silverton, and Sandon. And so the dominating factor in the tax base in this area was the West Kootenay Power. The only other factor of any consequence was Burns Lumber, or Passmore Lumber. And Slocan in itself didn't have a mill at the time. This little mill that I mentioned earlier, run by Japanese people, was there, and it was come and go sort of situation. The transportation on the highways wasn't all that good. I realize that. The roads weren't as good as they are now. But this was in the early 50s, 52, 53, and so on. And some of the people wanted this high school at each end, and one in Slocan, one down here at Mount Sentinel. Some of us in the middle said, no, let's build one high school, we'll say at Passmore, and bring the students both ways. And because there wasn't all that many students, you see. And of course the curriculum wasn't as expanded as it is now either. So to support those of us who wanted the school in the middle of the valley, not exactly in the middle of the valley, but up in the valley, there was the problem of power. There was no hydropower at that time beyond Crescent Valley here. Mm-hmm. And no likelihood of it happening either in the immediate future. So Slocan had their own little hydropower plant, and it needed upgrading in the worst way, and the best thing that could happen to them would be a school to be built there, and that would provide a good cash customer, you see, for them to get some revenue from. Mm-hmm. The West Kootenay Power, showing some self-interest, they said, oh no, you know, we need it down here, we're the biggest taxpayer and so on, the school should be built down here. Well, then they decided that they should build one in each end. Mm-hmm. And those of us who wanted it located in the middle of the valley, they said, well, it's just as cheap to bus them from the middle of the valley to both ends as it is from both ends to the middle. So what are you talking about? And then there's the power question. Well, Gordon Burns came up and said, if you will build the school in the Passmore area, which there was quite a bit of level land and so on, I will put in a steam-driven generator that will upgrade my mill, and I'll provide you with power. Mm-hmm. That's one thing I'll do, but I'll only do that if the West Kootenay will not put power up here, because I want to upgrade the mill, and I need the electric power, far more than what I have at the present time. So if the West Kootenay will put a power line in here, that answers the problem. If they won't do that, I'll put in my own power plant, which he did. Huh. But the powers that be had their way, and the school was built at both ends. Long after Gordon left, what Gordon did was he bought the steam driven generator set from the city of Lethbridge. Once the Alberta government put hydro into all these places, that was up for sale, and he grabbed it and put it in there and ran it for years after, and supplied his own mill and the Passmore area. When the mill got moved to Slocan, the Burnses then were out of it. And that caused a drain on the school system. The students could make more money working in the mills in the afternoon shift and on weekends than they could going to school. They could make as much money as the teachers. And that depleted the school numbers, population. And so we wound up having a problem on our hands with 2 high schools, and we barely had enough students for one. Yeah. And had we followed what Gordon Burns was proposing or was supporting, proposals were made by local residents, and he supported them, that probably never would have happened. We'd only had one high school, regardless of the number of students.
And did you close the high school in Slocan?
Well, I'll tell you, that was a long, drawn-out battle, and we didn't exactly close it, but we took it down from grade 12 to grade 9, and it's functioning quite well now. And the 10s, 11s, and 12s come to Mount Sentinel.
So the Patrick Lumber Company was by far the largest of the mills.
Oh
in
yes.
This area
until recent years.
Until just lately.
Yeah.
But there were a number of smaller mills that operated up the creeks, cut lumber for a few years, and then moved on.
Yes. Well, I guess the Winlaw Mill was probably one of the other biggest mills around, and it wasn't a big mill compared to this one by any means, but it was a good substantial mill, and they had a big lumber yard and quite a good stock of lumber and so on, and they were functioning on the kind of a basis that they could handle, the mill could cut all the logs they could get, put it that way, and they could get enough logs to keep the mill going.
They would have been cutting in the earliest years primarily for the local demand, but Patrick would have been shipping to the prairies?
Yes, Patrick was shipping abroad, and it's funny, but Minneapolis became one of the biggest lumber broker locations in what I suppose you'd call the West, you know. And I guess more carloads of lumber went through Minneapolis than any other single place. The mills, of course, like in the days of Winlaw and the early days of Patrick and Co., you can imagine the mining buildings, the towns like Silverton, New Denver, and so on that were growing up. And the mine itself needed the timbering, you know, and the mine camps and sidewalks and everything had to be built, you know. And a lady just asked me the other day, how come everything was built on posts instead of on concrete, you know? This lady had lived in New Denver in the early days, and I said, just no time. And before the railroad was built, how did you transport cement, just dry cement into a town, you know? You couldn't take it, and it took 3 days from Shoreacre Bridge to Slocan Lake by going up the river, you know, with a boat, rowing and poling and pulling, and so yes, the mine and everything it brought with it demanded a supply of lumber, and they even had small mills in some places run by water power and hand power, where men stood in a pit and used a whipsaw and cut some lumber, you know, timbers usually, and hewed them. Oh boy, a fellow with a broad axe could make ties and so on like you wouldn't believe, just as smooth as, almost like a planer mill. And that became a real art in itself, and it was now long gone, you know. I guess the broad axe is something they copied from the man that used to do the beheading in the old days, you know.